Yeah, we'll begin with the Yerushalmi in Kilayim.
Okay, so Yerushalmi, please. Let's go. We have everything here, as you know, in the book. We've got everything semi-Masudar. So let's go to work here. Yerushalmi is on page 441.
Yeah. So if I may, we'll begin just briefly reviewing the Gemara, which was this week's limud. And again, thank you for the Eilam's forbearance with allowing me to reschedule the shir and have the schus to participate in Talmud Torah de Rabbim, despite the change in schedule. The Gemara on BRACHOS on Daf Mem, we'll just recall briefly. The Gemara says, Heicha mevarchin on Beir Pri Ha'etz. The bracha of Beir Pri Ha'etz is determined by Heicha de chishoklis le'lepere isi legabza v'hodar mapik. The Gemara describes that what makes something eligible for the bracha of Beir Pri Ha'etz is where if the pri is removed and something called the gabza remains, v'hodar mapik, and then from that remaining gabza, fruit once again grows, that enables a bracha Beir Pri Ha'etz to be made. Aval heicha de kishoklis le'lepere, where the fruit is taken leise legabza, the gabza no longer is extant, v'hodar peri, and therefore peri does not then grow. From that gabza, loy mevachin le'Beir Pri Ha'etz. Now, in the second half of the limud, Be'ez Hashem and Bli Neder, which was the part of the limud that I joined for, we'll discuss in detail the various shittas harishonim in defining what the gabza is. But the question that I want to begin the limud with, Be'ez Hashem, is a different question. And that is, the Gemara in Brachos discusses what's considered an Elon and what's considered a Yer. The question then we want to ask is this sugya a sugya that we only find in Perek Ketzad Mevarchim? Because the nafkimina between something being an Elon or something being a Yerek would seemingly have nafkiminas in a number of sugyas, besides the sugyas of Birchas Hanenin. For example, if something is considered an Elon or something is considered a Yerek, has a nafkimina in the dinem of Kilayim. Kilayim bakerem is only osir if it's Kilayim of a Gefen and Zroim. But something which is an Elon doesn't have the same din of Kilayim bakerem. So too, if something is an Elon or something is a Yerek, would have a nafkimina in a din doiraisa if what it produces has the restrictions of Arla. A Yerek is mutter immediately, whereas the peiros of an Elon have a din of Arla. Another nafkimina doiraisa is benegea to the dinim of Tuma, if the bark of that particular growth would have the din of eitz, which would then be metame like an eitz, or would it have the din of a Yerek, in which case it's metame tumas oichlin, but it's not metame like an eitz. And so there are possibly three, and we'll encounter further sugyas as we proceed, which have an nafkimina in determining whether or not something is an Elon or something is a Yerek. And therefore the question is our sugya in Ketzad Mevarchim, that gives the simon of heicha the shokil peri v'isa legabza, or heicha the shokil peri v'leisa legabza, is that something specific to the halachas of Birchas Hanenin? And therefore, what determines whether something is an Elon and a Yerek in Kol HaTorah Kula? Now, the Yerushalmi in the end of the 5th parak of Kilayim, and the same Yerushalmi appears in the end of the 4th parak of Maestras, brings a Tosefta, and that Tosefta is actually quoted briefly by the Rosh, and we'll come back to the Rosh in the continuation of the Limud, where the Yerushalmi quotes a Tosefta, which is actually in the end of the 3rd parak of Kilayim, but the Yerushalmi brings it, like we said, in the end of the 5th parak of Kilayim, where the Yerushalmi brings a Tosefta which says, Toni Reb Chinana bar Papa. Reb Chinana bar Papa says, Es shehu oile migizoi min Elon, that it rises from its geza, from a trunk, is a min ilon that defines it as a tree. Mishoroshov min yerek. If it rises from its shoroshim, then it's considered a yerek. So the Pnei Moshe explains that es sha'oila means if the anofim, if the branches come out of a trunk, geza ha'ilon, and don't come out from the root, directly from the root in the ground, that qualifies as an ilon. Whereas if it comes from the shoroshim, it's a min yarek. The Yerushalmi continues, Hatiboin, hare hakruv, hare hu oile migizoi. What about the kruv? Hare, the kruv, which is a form of cabbage, comes from the geza. It doesn't come from a shirish, it comes from a geza. From the ground there rises some kind of central trunk, central stem from which the kruv grows. And we know that in the dinim of kilayim, kruv is considered a yerek. Answers the Yerushalmi, kan bevadai, kan besofik. So if we take the Yerushalmi simply, before we get to the conclusion of the Yerushalmi and what the Yerushalmi means when the Yerushalmi distinguishes between Vadai and Sofik, seemingly we have a klal of the Yerushalmi benegea to the dinim of kilayim, that if we want to know if something is a yerek or something is an ilon, with an afkemina being benegea to the dinim of kilayim bakerem, the difference would be if it grows from the ikar or if it grows from the anofim grow from the shirish. And this is pasken by the Rambam in HILCHOS Kilayim in Perek Hey Halacha Chof. The Rambam says the following: Zeh haklal, kol hamoitzi ilon mi olin me ikroi. Anything that produces olin, which means twigs or leaves, from its central stem, harei ze yerek. That's a yerek. Because she'enoi moitzi olin me ikroi, harei ze ilon. So the Rambam paskins this Yerushalmi as determining the din in Kol HaTorah Kula of what's akoponim benegea to the dinim of kilayim, and seemingly that would be a klal in Kol HaTorah Kula. What determines something as being an ilon and what determines something as being a yerek. And it's important to point out that this Rambam is not just the Shitas Rambam, but the Mechaber himself in Shulchan Aruch, in Yeridea, and Siman Reish Tzadik Vav, Siftes Vav. The Mechaber paskins this klal of the Rambam in HILCHOS Kili Akerem. The Mechaber brings that if you want to determine whether something is an ilon, so there isn't a din of Kili Akerem deraisa, or something is zera, which has a din of Kili Akerem deraisa, says the Mechaber, the klal is like the Rambam explains, that the difference is if the olim come out from the base of the plant, which is like the Rambam's, the olim come from the ikir, or if the olim come from a stem. That l'chura is gepaskent in the Rambam and would seem to be a klal benegea to kilayim, and from there to Kol HaTorah Kula. If we continue in the Yerushalmi, we find a remarkable machlokes how to learn the maskon of the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi asks from kruv that kruv comes from the geza and nonetheless is considered a yerek benegea to kilayim, and the Yerushalmi says kan bevada kan besofik. Now, in the case of the Yerushalmi's teretz of kan bevada kan besofik, we have a basic. Yes, we have a basic machlokes achronim how to understand what the teretz of the Yerushalmi is.
Yellow, the last line.
The Pnei Moshe, and there's a mashmos like that in the Rash, seem to understand that kan bevada kan besofik means is that we can have cases of kruv which are yerek, and we can have cases of kruv which are an ilon. And therefore we're saying like this: kan bevada kan besofik means that there are cases of kruv which have the din of a yerek, and there are cases of kruv which have the din of an ilon. And therefore the chumrah, we have to say that if in the case of kilayim bakerem, we would have to treat kruv as possibly not an ilon but a yerek, and therefore the chumrah consider it to be osir, to be nizra in the kerem. That's the pshat that the Pnei Moshe says. However, the Gra we mentioned before that this same Yerushalmi is brought in the end of Perek Daled of the Yerushalmi of Meiser. And there in Meiseres, in the end of Perek Daled, the Gra says an entirely different pirush of Kan Bevadai Kan Besofik. And this Gra will open up the sugya to what defines Yerek and what defines an Elon. In the pirush of the Gra on the Yerushalmi in Meiseres, the Gra says the following. On that the Yerushalmi says, Kan bevadai kan besofik, he says, Zok the Goin, and this is in the Ksav Yad Aleph of the Goin. He says, Kan bevadai means like this. The Pnei Moshe, as we said that there are two types of kruv, and misofik we have to be machmir to treat kruv like a yerek in a keren. The Goin's lashon is the following: Devada yadinon duhu yerek. In the case of kruv, we are certain, says the Goin, that it's a yerek. Ve'af de chazinon de oila migizoi. Even though we see it's inconsistent with the general rule that something whose branches come out from a geza is considered an elon, in the case of kruv, we know that it's a yerek. So where does it apply the rule of the Yerushalmi, that where the branches come out from a geza, that's considered an elon and not the yerek? Zok the Goin, omnam haklal hu bedovar shehu sofik lonu im elon hu a yerek. Ukesheroyim sha'oile migizoi amrinon min elon. The Goin says a dover nifla pshat in the Yerushalmi. He says that there are instances where we know that something is a yerek, and then the Yerushalmi's klal doesn't apply. It's only in the case where we're unsure if something is a yerek or an elon, there we apply the klal of the Yerushalmi. Zok the Chazanish in Arla, in the end of Arla, in Siman Yud Beis, Be'ikr and Sivkot and Gimel, the Chazanish points out, as we just mentioned, the chiddush that's mavur in this Goin, that the Goin is saying that there is an objective way to determine something is a yerek before we need to resort to the Yerushalmi that distinguishes between an elon and a yerek based on whether or not the branches come from a geza or the branches come from the ground. Zot the Chazanish, it's mavur in the Gra that there is some way to determine yerek or elon besides the Yerushalmi. Vaistachois, if we now return to the question that we began with, before our Gemara in Ketzan Mevarchem of Shokele Leperi Isa Legavza or Leisa Legavza, what determines Elon and Yerek? So we had a klal that with the Rambam Paskins based on the Yerushalmi quoting a Tosefta that it depends on whether or not the Anofim go from the Geza or the Anofim grow from the Sheirish. Zot the Chazanish, it's mavur in the Gra that there are instances where something will be inconsistent with the siman of the Yerushalmi, but will still be considered yerek. And Ba'atzem, it's possible that we can have two types of kruv, one of which will be considered a yerek, and one of which will be considered an elon, and we don't know how to determine that. So now the question we want to ask is, what determines this objective din of yerek, which means we don't have to resort to the din of the Yerushalmi Zot the Goin except if we have a suffix? What is it that defines that something's a yerek? So here we find Dvarim Nifloim in a number of Achronim, and the Yesod HaDvarim is a shaila that is discussed in the Kadmoinim, is discussed already in the Zman of the Radvaz and the Maram Alshech. There was a controversy over whether or not eggplant was mutter to be eaten. What was the shaila? The shaila is that eggplant seems to grow on a plant which would have the simonim of an elon according to the Yerushalmi. Dahainu, it has an ikar, and the anofim are yoitzim min ikar. And therefore, the Birkei Yosef Be'ikar, who summarizes this discussion, he discusses it briefly in Siman Reish Gimel and references it again in the halachas of Kilayim in Siman Reish Tzadik Daled in Yeridea, The Birkei Yosef brings that there were machmirim that did not eat eggplant because of the din of arla. Now, we'll come back, further in the limud to discuss whether or not the Yerushalmi discussing kilayim bakerem, if something is a yerek or an elon, and as paskin in the Rambam and HILCHOS kilayim, and as discussed by the Goyin benegea to the din of kruv, does that determine necessarily the din of arla? And we'll see that's a discussion in the Achreinim. But the Birkei Yosef brings that there were machmirim who didn't eat eggplant because an eggplant should be considered arla based on the simonim of the Yerushalmi that determines elon or yerek. And here we find a remarkable series of svaras that Rabbi Seinu Achronim, the Gedolei Achronim, present to decide whether or not eggplant is a yerek or an elon. And none of those simonim seem to have any makor in the Yerushalmi that we saw or in our sugya in Ketzad Mevarchim. Let's take some examples. The Birkei Yosef brings a svara in the name of the Maram Alshech that the reason why eggplant can't be considered to have the din of arlan is not peris or elon, is because the way the eggplant grows is that each successive year after it's planted, its fruit, its produce gets more and more inedible. It becomes more and more inferior. Therefore, says the Maram Alshech, the definition of an elon is that the peiros improve year by year, whereas the definition of a yerek is that the peiros don't necessarily improve. Memela zot the Maram Alshech, the reason why eggplant doesn't have the din of arla is because its peiros are garua v'hoilech. One svara. A second svara is mentioned in the Tshuvas HaRadvaz. The Tshuvas HaRadvaz has a different reason why eggplant shouldn't be considered to have the Isser of Arla and isn't Peres or Elon, because the eggplant produces fruit within a year of being planted, and an Elon usually requires a year before it produces fruit. And therefore, since the behavior of the eggplant in terms of a tree, in terms of how it produces fruit is different from a standard Elon, therefore it has a din of Yerek, not the din of Elon. A second svara. A third svara is a svara of the Chidah in Sefer Machzik Bracha, brought in Arechaim in Siman Reish Gimel, where the Machzik Bracha says, and this svara is actually an important svara in the Poskim, which is discussed, as we'll see Be'ez Hashem in the Limud further, by the Nishmas Adam, and so too Reb Moshe and Igros Moshe discusses this svara in a number of places, that where the growth is very low, it's nomuch ma'oid in the lashon of the Machzik Bracha, and doesn't look like a tree, and it's very unclear exactly what that shear is. Is it Gimel Tvachim? Is it more than Gimel Tvachim? And we'll come back to that later, Bli Neder. The Machzik Bracha says a svara that where a growth is nomuch ma'oid, it's clear that that's an yerek and not an elon, and therefore eggplant, which he says if anyone would look, would see how low the plant is, avada, that's considered a yerek. So too, we have a remarkable svara of the Chazon Ish in that same place in Arla, where the Chazon Ish says that if a plant fruit will be inedible after 3 years, such that if we apply the dinim of Arla, the tree will never be able to be eaten, the produce of the tree will never be able to be eaten. Zot the Chazon Ish efsher, that there should be a gidul that has the Isser of Arla that will never be able to be etten. The svara of the Chazon Ish.
Page 446. Page 446, at the bottom, at the top of the page, is the Chazon Ish.
It's kedai to mention a svara, which is in the Sefer Kaftor Vaferach from Rabbi Shtori Aparchi, where Rabbi Shtori Aparchi says that anything where the stem is not hard like a tree, but is soft, is pliable, in that case also it has a din of a yerek. So to summarize, we have be'ikr 5 svaras in the Achronim that establish criteria for something being a yerek. We have the Maram Alshech that if the fruits as they grow continue to become more and more inferior, that's a yerek. We have the Tshuvas Radvaz that if something produces peiros within a year, it's a yerek. We have the svar of the Machzik Bracha, the Nishmas Adam and others, that if it's nomuch ma'oid, if it's very low, it's a yerek. We have the svar of the Chazon Ish, that's something that whose fruits will be inedible after 3 years, can't have the Isser of Arla. And the Kafta of Aferach, that if something is pliable, in that case, it can't be considered an eitz. And it's Kedai to be Mitzayin, and that svara is also mentioned by the Chuvas Divri Malkiel, by the Lom Zhirov, in his Chuvas, as a svara, what determines Yerek and Elon. And
Isn't there another svara about the hollow kana? Isn't that another siman?
Correct. That's another siman. The reason why I didn't mention that one is because that svara we only find in very much later achreinim. That we only find in the Chuvas Rav Pa'olim in much later achreinim. The hollow kana doesn't seem to have a clear makar in Kadmoinim. So I mentioned after that has a makar in Maram Al-Shech, in Chuvas Radvaz, in Chidah, the Chazon Ish based on the Yerushalmi and the Kafta of Aferach. But yes, there is a further svara when I get to a kana chol. But I couldn't find but only a clear makar for that in Kadmoinim. That's a svara mentioned only by later achreinim. Now, the obvious pella is where do these simonim come from? HaRav Yerushalmi in Kilayim, which the Rambam paskins in the dinim of Kili Akerem, and as Gepaskin Shulchan Aruch gives us one simon. If the olim come from the Iker, then it's an Elon. If the olim come from the Sheirish, then it's a Yerek. Where do these svaras come from? Mevur in the Goin, that the way that Goyin understands the maskon of the Yerushalmi from the question of Kruv, that if we looked at Kruv based on the siman of the Yerushalmi, it would be an Elon, because Kruv is Olam Yikra, it doesn't come from Yikra, it comes from a Geza. And on that, the Yerushalmi says we only apply the siman b'makom sofik, not b'makom vadai. Vice the Chois Mevur in Goyin, that there are objective criteria of determining Yerek before we come to the siman of the Yerushalmi. And therefore, these svaras of the Achroinim are svaras that are in the same way as Kruv, we understand, is not an Elon Zak the Goin, because of the Simonim that the Achroinim explain. For example, in the case of Kruv, Pashtus, it would be the svar of the Radvaz, that it produces Paris immediately. Or we have the svar of the Machzik Bracha, then it's Nomuch Ma'oid. Or we have the svar of the Kafta of Aferach, of Rakus Hakone. These svaras, according to the Gra, are mefurish mitoich divrei Yerushalmi, and even according to the Pshat of the Pnei Moshe and the Rash and the Kafta of Aferach, Hare in Kruv itself, we see that sometimes Kruv will be considered an Elon and sometimes Kruv will be considered Yerek. What would determine that? Kanira, there are other ways to determine Elon and Yerek besides the siman of the Yerushalmi. And therefore, we have a chidush that the Achronim extend to the dinim of Arla, that even if we would apply the siman of the Yerushalmi, and therefore that would determine that eggplant would be osir because it has the simonim of an Elon, Zok the Goyin, we only apply the siman of the Yerushalmi b'makom sofik, but b'makom vadai, we don't apply the siman of the Yerushalmi, and therefore the Yesod Hadvarim is to give the dinim of an eggplant to Yerek, which the Birkei Yosef says that there was a Kabbalah from the Arizal through Reb Chaim Vital that the Arizal ate the eggplant and wasn't choshesh to the dinim of Arla, and therefore we remain with this pshat in the Yerushalmi that there are objective criteria besides the siman of the Yerushalmi that will determine the dinim of Elon and Yerek. Now, we've said that the basis of the shaila in the case of eggplant was that the eggplant itself, the plant, seemed to have the simonim of an Elon, and the Achronim had various svaras to disqualify it from the dinim of Elon, and therefore to avoid the Isser of Arla. But in Elamite Shel Davar, in terms of what we have from the Rishonim, Ba'atzem, it's clear from the Rishonim, and we'll see that's possibly a machlokes of Rishonim, that the siman of the Yerushalmi b'negea to Kilayim may not determine b'chlal the dinim of Arla. Namely, the dinim of Arla depend on whether or not what's produced has the chashivos of pri ha'ilon. Whereas the dinim of Kilayim b'negea to Kilayim b'kerem doesn't depend on whether or not what is produced has the chashivos of pri, but whether or not the type of plant is an Elon or a Yerek. And the two dinim are chalukim zeh mizeh. For example, we can have something, the Rishonim say, that has a din of an Elon, b'negea to Kilai Elon, and therefore won't be osir midiraisa to be nizra bakerem, but its produce won't necessarily have the chashibus of pri benegea to arla. Where do we see that? That we see in our sugya. We'll recall the Gemara on Daf Lamed Vov Amud Aleph in the sugya of tzlaf was mavur that benegea to the dinim of the bracha of Bar Priya 8, those dinim are consistent with what has the isser of arla. There could be things that grow on tree, like koira, avioinois, tamrois, olim, that the Gemara has a shaklavataria that despite the fact that they grow on a tree, they may not have the chashivas of pri, and therefore won't have the isser of arla, and huadin won't have the bracha of Bar Priya 8. So the Gemara in Daf Lamed Vav Amud Aleph is mavur that arla and bracha are tali zeh b'zeh. But zok there are in chidushim over here in our sugya on Daf Mem, and the Ritva quotes this ra'ah. I'll just read the lashon of the Ritva in Chidushei HaRitva in our sugya. The Ritva says that our sugya, which discusses the bracha of Bar Priya 8, which the Gemara and Daf Lamed Vav says is also what determines the din of arla benegea to chashibus pri. Zok the Ritva in the end of Dibra Maschal Omer of Nachem Bar Yitzchak Rabbi Yehuda, he zok the Ritva, and this is the lashon. We'll pay a careful attention to the lashon of the Ritva. V'dafka le'inyan perioi, i'ika le'achshuvei, pri ha'etz oilo yehave ha'i klala. The rule of our Gemara, which discusses shokla le'peir v'isa legavza, le'isa legavza, which we'll come back to, is only benegea to determining the din of the pri. Aval le'inyan kil'ayim, i'ika le'achshuvei yerek oy ilon, dine achrina islehu. It has a different din. Zokter Ritva, in the sugya of Elon and Yerek, there are two nidoinim. There's what the actual Elon and Yerek are, and then there's the din of the peiros that they produce. Such that we can have a case where l'genegea to kil'ayim, it will have a din of Elon. Because of the klal of the Yerushalmi, if the anofim come out from the Iker, it's an Elon. If the anofim come out from the Karka, it's Yerek. But that does not necessarily mean that even if it's an Elon benegea to kilayim, it will have a din of Elon benegea to the pri itself. And therefore we can have something where legabe kilayim, it's an Elon, but legabe its peiros won't have the din of arla. And this is the Pesach, Zot the Ritva, to be mechalik between the sugya, the Yerushalmi and Kilayim, and our sugya of Isa legavza or Leisa legavza in the case of Krishoklas leleperi. Zot the Ritva, what's the chiluk? The chiluk is that the sugya in Kilayim is discussing the Gidul itself. And legabe Kilayim bakerem, it doesn't depend on whether or not what will be produced will have the chashivas of the pri. It depends on the plant itself, if it's an Elon or a Yerek. Masha enkim benegea to the dinam of Orla and Bracha, of them zot the Ritva, the sugya in Kilayim doesn't apply. Now, we'll see Be'ezer Hashem further that the Ra'ah himself is mesupik about this, and in the other pshat, the Ra'ah tries to make our Gemara Siman consistent with the Siman of the Yerushalmi, and so too the Mari Kurkus in HILCHOS Kilayim, Perek Hei Halacha Chaf, on the Rambam that we just saw, is also mesupik in Shitas Rambam, if the dinim of Kilayim benegea to Kilayim bakerem and the dinim of the pri benegea to bracha and arla are the same, also a suffix. But the Ritva's shita is that the two are not connected. That is soid, that there's one din benegea to pri and one din benegea to the Elon itself, the Ritva establishes. The Rishonim are just mesupik if the siman of our Gemara is consistent with the siman of the Yerushalmi or is inconsistent with the siman of the Yerushalmi, which Be'ez Hashem will come back to. If so, the fact that something, for example, the eggplant tree, would have the simonim benegea to the dinim of kilayim, that would make it possibly kilayim of Elon and not kilay zroim or kilayim bekerem. Nonetheless, that doesn't necessarily determine if its peiros have the dinim of arla, because peiros having the dinim of arla have their own chashivos and their own criteria. And therefore, we can have something, for example, that could be kilayim bekerem, but the peiros themselves won't have the dinim of arla. So, for example, the Svara Nifla of the Chazon Ish. that it can't be that something will produce peiros that will have the dinam of arla and will never be able to be eaten, may determine that the peiros don't have the din of arla, but may not determine that the plant itself won't have the din of ilam b'negea to kilayim. This chiluk we find mufurish in the Ritva. It's kedai to add a davar nifla that's brought in the gra the opposite way. Tosfos on Daf Mem Amud Aleph quotes a Yerushalmi. It's actually the earlier part of the Yerushalmi in Kilayim, which we saw before. Tosfos is discussing the din of otadadin. Otadadin are small bushes. Comes from the lashon of the pasuk in the end of Parshas Vayechi that they made an avel for Yaakov Avinu begoyren ha'otad. Otadadin are small bushes. Tosfos discusses whether otadadin, what the fruit that grows on an otad, has a din of boyer priya eitz or a din of boyer priya adama. So Tosfos brings a Yerushalmi that says that an otad is kilayim b'negea to ilana. In the din of kilayim has a din of an ilan, but negea to bracha, Tosfos says the din of kilayim from the din of bracha.
Page 11, please.
Page 11. Ordinarily, we understand the Yerushalmi, and that's
11.
what's mavur in the tzlach. That's what's mavur in the nishmas adam. That the difference that the Yerushalmi is making between an otod b'negea to the din of kilayim and an otod b'negea to the din of bracha is like this: that b'negea to kilayim, it can have the din of
an ilan.
Masha enkein b'negea to the din of bracha. Bracha, says the tzlach and the nishmas adam, is totally on chashivus hapri. So therefore we can have something that b'negea to kilayim is an ilan, and b'negea to HILCHOS brachos is totally on chashivus hapri. This is very much in line with the svara that in the chiluk that we had mentioned from the Ritva. Whereas the Ritva seems to be a broader chiluk in Tosfos, that the Ritva seems to be mechalik between pri and the gufa ilan. Rabbi Seinu Achreinim understand that Tosfos svara is b'negea to bracha, that bracha needs chashivus pri, and something that's an ilan b'negea to kilayim may not necessarily have chashivus pri legabe bracha. The Gra in his pirush to kilayim, in the Pira Gra to kilayim, explains the Yerushalmi in exactly the opposite way. Namely, Rabbi Seinu Achreinim understand the Yerushalmi that an otod has the din of an ilon b'negea to kilayim, but b'negea to bracha doesn't have chashivus pri. The Goin in his pirush in the bir to the Yerushalmi says exactly the opposite. He says the chiluk between it being a b'negea to bracha and b'negea to kilayim is the exactly reverse from the way Rabbi Seinu Achreinim understand. And the Goin's lashon is the following. The Goin's lashon is, just to read the lashon of the Gra actually in the beer itself, kedai just for the chidush that's mavur in the Goin. Zok the Gra, tamon the bracha, pirush, hodik tani hosam gabi ilon, haynu le'inyan bracha, ho lekilayim have a min deshoyim. The Goin says exactly the opposite. He says something can be legabe bracha could have the din of ilon, but legabe kilayim doesn't satisfy the conditions of an ilon. The Hainu, according to the Gra, when Tosfos says that an otod, it's choluk otod b'negea to kilayim and bracha, zok the Goin, we can learn exactly the opposite of Rabbi Seinu Achreinim. That it won't be an ilon legabe kilayim, but it will have a bracha of boyer priya eitz. Azay is mavur in the Pirush HaGra in Kilayim. Be'oifen that we see that it's choluk b'yesoidoi, the din pri b'negea to bracha and possibly arla, than the din pri b'negea to the dinim of Kilayim. And we have two hesberim for that. We either have what's mavur from the Ra'ah and the Ritva, that it's choluk b'yesoidoi, the din of the pri in Kol HaTorah Kula, than the din of the Ilan that produces it. Or we have the svar of Rabbi Seinu Achreinim that narrow that to the din of bracha, that bracha needs a particular chashivus pri, and therefore not necessarily the something which is an ilan legabe kilayim give it the din of Bar Pri Eitz. The Gra is mavur the opposite, that something could have the chashivas of Pri Legabe Bracha, but not have the chashivas Legabe Kilayim of it being an Elon. And that's a Dover Nifla, that's mavur mitoich the Gra. But homios, what we have now, mitoich Rabbeinu Achreinim, we have mitoich both Rabbeinu Rishonim, and possibly mitoich the Gra, that the Yerushalmi and Kilayim, which the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch paskin, that the din of Elon and Yerek depends on whether or not the Anofim come out from the Ikar or come out from the Karka, that the din may be a din only benegeh to Klai Elon, but will not determine the Fida Ritva and the Ra'ah, the din of the Pri at all. And according to the way that Rabbi Seinu Achroin and the Tzlach and the Nishmas Adam understand B'Shittas HaTosfos, it won't determine Chashivus Pri benegeh to the dinim of Bracha. So to summarize, we began with a question: is our sugya in Ketzal Mevarchim a sugya benegeh to the din of Elon and Yerek l'kol HaTorah kula, or are there other criteria that determine the din Yerek and Elon l'kol HaTorah kula? We can now summarize as follows: it's mavur mitoich the girsa of the Gra and the Yerushalmi, and possibly even the Pnei Moshe and the Rash, benegeh to the din of Kruv. Kan bevadei, kan besofik, that there are oifanim in which we can determine something to have an objective din of Yerek before we resort to the simon of the Yerushalmi, which means we have a series of dinim that determine something to be Yerek, even though it's inconsistent with the simon of the Yerushalmi. And we mentioned be'ikr 5 mahalchim that we find in the Kadmonim on this shayla: the Birkei Yosef, the Radvaz, we find the Machzik Bracha, the din of the Chazanish of period that's not roi terchim moshonim, and the kafta vaferach of rakus hakon. We then went on to say that it's mavur in the Ritva and the Ra'ah, that the simon of the Yerushalmi doesn't necessarily bichlal determine the din of Pri. The simon of the Yerushalmi only determines the din of the Elon. It doesn't determine the din of the Pri. And that is mashma and the Ritva is a din that's negeh even for the dinim of Arla. Pri and Elon a choluk zemizeh. Further, we have the way Rabbi Seinu Achroinim understand the Tosfos that the Yerushalmi that Tosfos quotes, Tamon lebracha and Tamon lekilayim, that the Tzlach and the Nishmas Adam explain that bracha requires a particular criteria of chashivus apri, and if it requires the particular bracha of chashivus apri, mimele, then it may have a din of Elon benegeh to Kilayim, but may not necessarily have the din of Elon benegeh to the bracha of Bar Pri Eitz. And remarkably, we saw in the Gra, in the Bir, in Kilayim, that the Gra understands that we can also have the reverse. We can have something that is a Yerek benegeh to Kilayim, but the Gabe bracha will have a din of Bar Pri Eitz because it will have Chashivus Pri. We'll come back to this a little bit later in the limud, but it's the appropriate place to point out that this discussion as to whether the difference between kilayim and bracha is a difference between a fundamental difference between Pri and Elon, or is a difference only between bracha and kilayim, should have a broad nafkamina. If we're understanding the Ritva and the Ra'ah correctly, that the Ritva and the Ra'ah are saying that there's a difference between Kilayim, which requires just that the Elon itself should have a din of Elon, but there's a separate nafkamina benegeh to the Pri, then in a case where the Pri itself doesn't have the din of Pri benegeh to Arla, and therefore benegeh to Bracha, as the Gemara in Daf Lamed Vav says, it also won't have the din of Bracha Bar Pri Eitz. L'chayra, the din should follow that b'di'eved, if one makes a Bar Pri Ha'etz on a Pri that does not have the chashivos of Bar Pri Ha'etz as determined in the Sugya and Ketzal Mevarchim, and will not have the dinim of Arla, one will not be Eitz b'di'eved. Because what's lacking isn't just chashivos Pri le'inyan bracha, but what's lacking is the entire definition of Pri b'negeh l'kol HaTorah kula. It's not a din of Pri l'gabi Arla either. And in that case, if the Eved one would have made the bracha Bar Pri Eitz, one wouldn't be Yotzei. Whereas Zok the Tzlach, according to the way says the Tzlach that I understand Tosfos, that the difference between Kilayim and bracha is only because bracha requires an additional condition of Chashivus Apri, but La'olam the pri itself has the din of pri ha'etz, just legabi bracha, it lacks that condition of chashivos, and therefore it's brachas ber pri adama. Zok the tzlach, in that case, if b'di eved you made the bracha ber pri eitz, avada you'd be eitze. And we'll see Be'ez Hashem later in the limud that the Nishmas Adam himself, despite the fact that he also subscribes to this understanding of Tosfos, that the difference between kilayim and bracha is chashivos, he argues with the tzlach and says, avada b'di eved, you won't be able to be eitze with the bracha of ber pri eitz. But the Nekuda which you want to emphasize is that according to the Ritva, if we are lacking the conditions of the Sugya and Ketzah Mevarchim, we are lacking the entire din of Pri. Kol HaTorah Kula, what determines Elon and Yerek is benegeh to the din of Kilayim of the Guf HaGidol. Whereas the negeh of the Sugya of Ketzah Mevarchim is determined the din of Pri. If, however, we understand that al derech, the way Rabbi Sein Rachrenim explained in Tosfos, that it's only an additional condition of bracha, then the Chanami, it's a pri and it's pri ha'etz and kol HaTorah kula l'gai arla. Nonetheless, it won't have the bracha of ber pri eitz because it will lack chashivas pri. Let's now return to our sugya, and the sugya of the chishakos le'leperi isa legavza v'hoda mafik, or the chishakos le'leperi v'hoda leisei. Before determining, as we've mentioned, what this siman is and how it fits into the context of Kol HaTorah Kula, namely the siman of the Yerushalmi in Kilayim benegeh to Elon and Yerek, the simonim that Rabbi Sein Rachrenim give that objectively defines a Yerek, the idea that we can sometimes have something in Elon that's still not a pri the Ritva, we first need to define the basic terms of what is Isa legavza and Leise legavza. So for this, we have a very concise summary in Shulchan Aruch HaRav. The Shulchan Aruch HaRav in Seder Birchas HaNehenin summarizes the Shittos in Perek Vav Oiz Vav. And essentially, the Shulchan Aruch HaRav sets out three Shittos in the Sugya. One Shitta is that Isa, one shita, the first shita is that Isa legabze means
1 second, please. 441.
That actually the branches of the tree, the branches themselves, the twigs, have to continue to be able to be kayam after the fruit is picked. And the Tilul David says that the makar of that shita is the Mordechai in the name of the Maram and the Mogen Avram in the name of the Agudah. Remarkably, if we actually look in Rashi on Daf Mem Amud Aleph, Rashi's mefurish like that. Rashi on Dibur HaMaschil Gavza says, Ha'anaf shel ha'etz. It means the twig, the anaf of the eitz. So Rashi sheet seems to also be a makar for this first sheet of the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, that Isa the Gavza mean that the branches, the twigs themselves have to continue to exist. That is the Shita of Rashi, which is the narrowest l'chura of all the Shitas HaRishonim in terms of what could be considered an Elon. According to Rashi, the only thing qualifying an Elon is if the twigs and the branches remain continuously there even after the fruit is picked. In the lashon of the Achreinim, it means once the winter comes and the plant shrivels. According to Rashi, the only type of growth which would have a din of an elon would be if the full branches of the tree remained intact. The second shita we have is that the ikar, which broadly we understand means the trunk or the central part of the plant, that needs to continue to exist after the plant of fruit. That is the type of gavza, that gavza means the ikar. The Tilul says that is of the loss of in similar Tur brings of the matzah but shuvas in the sit
breaking up.
The goy something which is considered that the Gavzo is not Kayim, Rabbi say. The Gavzo is not Kayim, is what case?
It's bandwidth.
Where all that remains is the Shurish. It dries out in the fall. And its branches and its leaves are completely go out of existence. And then it grows again from the shorish. That if as long as something is there more than meaning the tree hasn't evolved down, but something more than the continues, in that case, the would be appropriate. That even if the branches, the twigs don't continue to exist, if the icarus come all the way into the shirish.
Okay, everybody, so we're obviously having a bandwidth problem.
The bracha, like second shita. The first shita is we should be.
Can the Rav hear me? Can the Rav hear me?
Can the
Rav hear me? Can he hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so
yes.
we're having the last 2 minutes we had a bandwidth problem. The Rav was going through the Shushitas. He seemed to have stabilized now. We weren't able to hear for the last minute or so. So let's rerun the last, I think the second shita, the Rosh.
So we left off in the shita like IYUNIM. Yeah.
We did this.
So the second shita of the Shulchan Aruch, as long as it's more from the IYUNIM, that the IYUNIM explain that the only case in which the would be reduced to Ber Pri Adama would be in a case where only the Sherish was in existence. Muvur, that if the Ikka remained, that would be sufficient. The third shita is the shita of only the Sherish needs to be Kayim, which is the shita of the Rosh and David, and that is the shita of Tosfos. That Tosfos is Muvur, that Tosfos says, Mehocha nired tusim praises hayotze bahem tzrichen levarach lebra eitz decha eitz lisayim yom rabim b'shakil hapri b'shana zu hodar asa pri ba'isa eitz atzma, which this continues, any form of bush is considered sufficient according to Tosfos to make bracha of ber pri eitz, and therefore the third shita of that the Shulchan Aruch brings is the shita of Tosfos. Now, and with this Be'ez Hashem will come to the conclusion of the Limud. Is that in this case, that the Rishonim seem to have a sense of simonim to determine whether or not something is ber pri eitz or ber pri adama. Either have to have according to Rashi that the twigs and the branches, the trunk, or the roots. The Achronim on Iskashe and Barosham, the Bach and the Drisha Afnart. How is this consistent with the simon that we had in the Yerushalmi and Kilayim, that the din of Peres Ta'ilon is totally on whether or not the Anofim are yotze from the Ikar and the Anofim are yotze from the Sherish. Here we seem to have a different series of simonim that determine whether or not something's bracha is ber pri eitz or ber pri adama. Seemingly, as long as to the Rosh, the Sherish, and according to the IYUNIM that the trunk, that would seem to be of a needle requires another condition. Just have to come out from those. So here we find this of Nachrim.
Maybe the Rav and Schuldig, maybe the Rav can move, if possible. I don't know. Maybe you can move the computer a few meter away, one side or the other, because in the last few moments you've been breaking up. Shuck a little bit. No, I don't know. I think it's the bandwidth is sometimes slightly better. Shuckle the what? The whole apartment? Shuckle the computer? Himself? Because of the shuckling, you mean? The Ta'ilim is asking maybe the Rav would. It sounds like a bandwidth issue. Let's try it again.
Yeah, I'll if I'm breaking up, we'll conclude the limud. And just to point out that
now it's better. Maybe staying stationary helps a little bit with the bandwidth.
Okay. So,
it's definitely a bandwidth issue. Okay, I hear that.
Yes.
Flaima.
So just to mention, there are fundamentally two mahalchim in the Achronim, how to make these two tanoim in Peres Elon consistent. Just time allows us just to mention what's mavur in the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, and the reason why it's important to mention what's mavur in the Shulchan Aruch HaRav is because what's in mavur in Shulchan Aruch HaRav seems to be closest to the Lashon Rishonim. The Shulchan Aruch HaRav says that in fact there is no need to make the conditions at all, because in fact, and the conditions that the Rishonim mention about how the tree decomposes during the winter and how that determines the din of Elon and Pri is irrespective of the condition of whether or not twigs emerge from the Iker or emerge from the Sheirish. And in fact, two entirely separate and independent conditions. And therefore, says the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, and it's a key point lahalacha, that our whole sugya that says sha'isa legavze or leisa legavze is predicated on the condition of the Yerushalmi and Kilayim that the Anofim come out of the Iker and don't come out of the Sheirish. And this is most consistent with the Lashon of the Rosh, that the Rosh says that B'Tosefta yesh oid Tanai. The Rosh says in the Tosefta additional Tanai. The Lashon of the Tosefta clearly is mashma, that besides conditions mentioned in the three shittas mentioned in the Rishonim, of what has to continue to exist when the tree decomposes during the winter, the Shulchan Aruch HaRav says all that is predicated on the Yerushalmi in Kilayim. And we'll conclude the limud just with what the Shulchan Aruch HaRav adds in parentheses, and he says, "V'af shenikro ilon le'inyan boirei atzei b'somim, u'kemoi she'ein nikro ilon le'inyan kili akerem."
Left side of the parentheses.
So Zot the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, and this is a key point, and this really serves as a our limud.
On the left
even
side.
though the Yerushalmi in Kilayim is the precondition of our sugya, and without the Yerushalmi in Kilayim, there's no discussion if something is an Elon or not. However, Zot the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, there can still be something which is an Elon legabe Kilayim, but not an Elon legabe bracha. Zot the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, it even goes a step further. That even in those brachos, something can have the bracha of boirei atzei b'samim, but still the fruit will not have the din of pri legabe bracha. And this is the remarkable din. Later on, and Be'ez Hashem will reach Limudim, on Daf Mem Gimel, the Gemara discusses what has a boirei atzei b'samim and what has a din of boirei isvei b'samim. HaRav, even if some have a din of 8 benegeh to atzib b'samim, would not have the din necessarily of boirei pri ha'etz benegeh to bracha. Zot the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, because the din of boirei atzib b'samim depends on the gufo ilon, whereas in the case of bracha, it depends on the din of the pri. Again, we see in the Shulchan Aruch HaRav the din of this ritzvah, that it's choluk b'soidoi, the etzem ilon itself, from the din of its payers. To conclude with this, this is a Pesach to discuss a kushya niflo that the Pnei Yeshua discusses. Rabbi say to those of us who daven Masach Ashkenaz, and we say Ba'alikin every Leil Shabbos, Kol hayotzim mino eitz einem kol hayotzim adlikin ba'el pishton, v'kol hayotzim mino eitz ein metami tumas oyolim el pishton. Pishton has a din of an eitz. Fragt the Pnei Yeshua, Pishton has a din of an eitz. Is there a tzad that Pishton should have a din of an elon? Gabe other dinim? The kasha is discussed at length by the Nishmas Adam. But mitoich the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, we see again that the two sugyas are chok. When Pishton has a din of an eitz, that means its structure, the etzem dovar, its growth can give it the din of an eitz. But avada legabe other dinim, will it have the din of pri or an elon legabe other dinei atayra? Not necessarily. Often that it can come to the maimed is the maskana of the Shulchan Aruch HaRav that it's choluk be a soidoi. The din benegeh to the etzem elon, which is Yerushalmi Kilayim, which is the precast of our sugya, and the din of our sugya, which is discussing additional conditions benegeh to the bracha.